What did you do to help get the ADA passed? Charlie Carr, Boston,
Okay. Well,
Massachusetts.
before the ADA, um, so now in 1980, the National Council for Independent Living was formed. And this was a group of us that came around from around the country to start an organization of independent living centers. And Max Starkloff was the organizer. Myself, Mark Bristow from Access Living, um, and a whole bunch of people had a meeting that Chris Palamas put on out in Lansing, Michigan, back in 1979 or 1980. And from that meeting, the National Council for Independent Living was started. And all of us got together again, and it was Lex and Max and Marka and a whole bunch of people, Chris. And at that time, there was discussion about civil rights. And over time, Lex and some others, not me, a little bit me, worked on something called the Civil Rights Restoration Act. And it was a way to go beyond Section 504, which was limited to federal funding, and to move into a broader arena, which was civil rights for people with disabilities generally. And the Civil Rights Restoration Act, I remember going to a couple of meetings in Washington, and I remember Lex Frieden at the front of the room, Ed, and one or two others with flip charts educating us, training us, teaching us about the dollars and cents, the level of discrimination, poverty. And I was a student, but eventually it went nowhere. And then the ADA became the way to go. So I remember meeting at Fred Fay's house in the mid 1980s, and when he was the titular head of a group that we called the Democrats with Disabilities. And our sole purpose was to organize people in the community who happened to be Democrats to vote. And also, we realized that we had an opportunity because our governor, Dukakis, was running for president, along with George Bush the Elder. And we said, you know what? The ADA then had been introduced, and it was working its way through the Congress. And we decided, let's get smart and ask each candidate, if they were elected, would they sign the Americans with Disabilities Act? And both of them wrote and said, yes, we would. So I remember that piece. The other piece was I was active in the National Council for Independent Living. I was the legislative advocacy co-chair along with a guy by the name of Jim DeYoung from Chicago. And our legislative committee was the one that oversaw the National Council's work on the ADA. And that was many, many teleconferences with Terry Savage from the Washington group, CCD. And we just had many conference calls, organizing. And I remember one thing that I'll share with you. We had all these disabilities. I will say that for the first time, the independent living centers nationally, of which there probably were a few hundred by then, I believe, and my colleagues may disagree with me, were the impetus for passing the ADA because we were organized. However, I remember Frank Bowe and deaf people not wanting to get involved. And people who are deaf, big D deaf, at that time and to some extent today, don't consider themselves people with disabilities. They wanted something in it for them, and there was nothing in it for them. So what we did to pull them in, and again, this is basic coalition building 101, was Title V, which was telecommunications access, something that deaf people want and needed and are benefiting from today. when Title V was added to the ADA, and I would defer to Pat Wright, who wrote the ADA, that was the piece that pulled deaf people in, and ultimately we had a pretty broad coalition of people with all kinds of disabilities. So a lot of organizing, a lot of educating, a lot of conference calls because it's easier to get to large groups of people, and a lot of local organizations like the Massachusetts Democrats with Disabilities organizing, getting out the vote, and eventually the Lou Harris poll came out and deemed people with disabilities as a sleeping giant that swung the election for George Bush. And he did indeed sign the ADA, and I had the distinct privilege of boiling my ass off sitting out on the lawn watching him sign it on the 26th of July in 1990. And it was a wonderful day.